Functional Training Workshop, Exercises Part 3 and Programming. So the objective of this module is to show the correct technique for basic exercises using cables and ropes, and to get an understanding of how to include these functional training exercises within a resistance training program for individuals or small groups. It's also to present functional programming considerations. After observation of this presentation, you should then complete the guided practice for this module, details of which are on the Learner Management System. So the cable drills that we'll look at include the standing rows, lateral step and overhead reach, the standing crunch matrix, split kneeling diagonal tricep extension, the reverse wood chop and the judo throw. From an application perspective, cable drills are suitable for increasing the core activation over more stable fixed path machines. So here we see the standing rows using the cable and the rope attachment. So this is a horizontal pull pattern. Obviously we're going to be utilising the legs and the hips and the core for stabilisation. So you'd set the rope or the cable at about hip to chest height, and it's a horizontal row pattern. So you're going to be working more stabilizers than you would do if you were performing the same kind of horizontal row on a seated row machine. And the lateral step and overhead reach, this is a great little exercise for really stimulating the lateral core musculature. So you stand side on with the handle kind of behind the head, and you take a step with the far leg and behind the other leg towards the cable column, and then you're going to reach upwards and towards the column with that hand. So you end up kind of making almost like a kind of ITB stretch with an overhead reach position at the end. And the quicker we do this, the more muscle spindle activation we're going to get, and the more it's really going to switch on those lateral core muscles. Now the standing crunch matrix is a combination of rotation and smash pattern movements. So we can move to the middle of the body. You can also rotate either side. So obviously when we come to the middle, it's a smash pattern movement. When we go to each side, it's going to be more of a rotation type pattern, a downwards diagonal rotation movement. So it's going to be very good for working the anterior and lateral core, as also well as the kind of hip flexor musculature. Then we have the diagonal tricep extension. So most people are familiar with the kind of tricep extension using a cable machine. So what we're doing here is we're adopting a split kneeling position, and you're coming over one shoulder, and it's the other leg that's kind of behind you. And what that does is it creates like a kind of rotational stress that you have to stabilize through your core muscles. So you are doing an isolation tricep exercise, but you're going to get a lot more core activation than if you're doing it on a machine or even just doing a standing tricep pushdown. And the next exercise we have is a reverse wood chop. We're doing this with one hand, so what we're going to be getting is still some upward rotation benefit, but we're also going to be really working the kind of posterior shoulder, so the external rotators of the shoulder, and the scapular stabilizers, so kind of trapezius rhomboid. So yeah, it's less kind of rotational stress and a little bit more kind of muscular activation for some of those postural deviations that we see with a lot of people. So back of the shoulder and the scapular retractors. Now we're not just keeping it pure arm movements. You can see we are rotating the torso down towards the cable at the bottom, and then obviously rotating upwards as we perform that movement. And then if you want a bit more of an actual rotation overload, then the judo throw, which we can do with a cable and the rope, is a great exercise for this. So what we do is you kind of face the cable column, you take a step away, and you're going to rotate the body around. And this is from it's a judo throw or jiu-jitsu throw. We can perform it very slowly. You see Mark here performing it quite dynamically from a martial arts background. So it's actually doing a little bit of a lunge movement at the same time, but it's mostly focused on the rotation pattern. Then I'm going to show you some battle rope drill. So very basic exercises. I'll show you about half a dozen variations of these. The majority of battle rope drills are going to be supplementary movements. So we're going to show you single waves, double waves, alternating waves, single lateral waves. The rotation waves actually come under the rotation pattern, so we can use that to train that movement pattern. And then we're also going to be doing waves with a reverse lunge. Obviously the waves part is supplementary, but with the reverse lunge we can include that within our squat pattern. So from a uses and application perspective, well, battle rope drills are suitable for beginners or advanced gym users to use in order to condition kind of upper body anaerobic fitness. So let's see some of these. So single rope waves, what we're going to do here is take one end of the rope, hold it in both hands. You always want slack on the battle rope, and then it's a simple up and down movement with the arms. You're trying to create nice rhythmical waves that look nice and pretty, with the waves getting all the way to the anchor point. So you can see we've got a nice stable base, good neutral spine position, no shrugging upwards of the shoulders as well. So in a nice athletic position. And we're simply going to try and do those up and down waves for anything between about 20 and 40 seconds. That's what we normally recommend. So once we've taught someone how to do it with a single waves, then we can move on to double waves. So we're going to be doing the same movement with both arms, like a mirror image of each other. Obviously it's much harder because now we're kind of having to generate the force with both ends of the rope rather than just one. So you can use the kind of hips and the legs a little bit more to help generate this force, but again, it's an up and down movement with the hands, so all sagittal plane, nice athletic position. We want to make sure there's slack on the rope, as we said at the beginning, and again, about 20 to 40 seconds is a good time period to do this for. So this up and down movement is really going to overload the metabolism, and therefore we're going to be getting cardiovascular benefits from doing this type of interval type training. So the next variation then is our alternating waves. So this is pretty much the same as double waves, but it's like a staggered. So as one hand is going up, the other hand is going down. Equally as kind of hard as the kind of double waves really. A little less hip movement to assist us. So again, we're looking at really kind of predominantly kind of focusing on the upper body here. The core and the lower body is keeping ourselves in a nice stable athletic position. It should be slack on the rope at the beginning, like we have with all the previous drills. And again, we're trying to create fast, snappy little waves, getting all the way to the anchor point that look nice and pretty. These waves are just, again, up and down, so it's all in the kind of sagittal plane. Now our single lateral waves, here we're kind of moving side to side. So more of a rotation pattern with these ones as well. So both hands on the rope, and you're kind of shifting from side to side, so very much kind of frontal and transverse plane kind of movement here. And the kind of pattern that we're after is almost trying to make like a snake type movement that gets again all the way to the anchor point. We can do this with kind of both ends of the rope, but best to start off just with one end of the single rope until people get the movement correct. And then we have our single seated rotation waves. So you can do these rotation waves in a variety of different positions. We're showing it to you seated. So you sit on the ground, bit of slack on the rope, and what you're doing is effectively you're coming up and over in an arc, and that's going to create these rotation wave patterns. As you can see, we're kind of almost trying to tap the rope either side of the thighs, coming towards the ground. But you want to make sure you're coming up and over in an arc rather than in front of the body, otherwise the rope is really going to get a lot of lateral movement and really going to slap from side to side, which is what we want to try to avoid. So really just think about coming up and over in an arc, working the rotation pattern, and then you'll have that technique nailed. Now there are lots of ways we can kind of progress some of these basic movement patterns. We're going to show you an example one here. So we're just going to be doing again these kind of single rope waves, but now we're actually making it a little bit more complex. We're adding a reverse lunge into the mix. So you get these waves moving, and then you're going to step back, lunge down, and then drive back up to the start position. You can do it all on the same leg, or you can alternate legs. It's a lot more complex because you're trying to coordinate both the wave generation with the upper body and then obviously the reverse lunge with the lower body. So this is really going to help to work the squat movement pattern as well, obviously quads and glutes kicking in addition to the upper body work that we're doing. Cables wise, well, we'd use freestanding cables exercises to teach integration of the stabilizer muscles, such as the legs, hips, and core, alongside kind of the prime mover muscle activation. We can adopt a variety of kneeling, split kneeling positions for more varied core activation, like we saw with the tricep extension. On the battle ropes, we'd want to use work periods of about 30 seconds. We normally say between about 20 to 40, so 30 seconds works pretty well, with a work to rest ratio of between 1 to 4 to 1 to 6. So if you are doing 30 seconds, you'd want anything between 2 to 3 minutes worth of recovery, which sounds like a lot, but if you go in hell for leather for those 30 seconds, then it should work out pretty well. You want to master the basic wave patterns, double waves, alternating waves, lateral, rotation, etc. before you start to adopt different body positions. So we could do angled, etc. Or you start to adding different movements, as we saw earlier with the reverse lunge. So if we review what we've kind of covered over some of the previous presentations, you want to include squat movement pattern exercises. And here we see some of these examples. So we've got the split kneeling leg drive at the top left. And then the next one to the right, we had our lateral squat and drag. We had a single leg squat or pistol squat. We then had our reverse crossover lunge and lateral sweep with the Viper, a dumbbell overhead squats, and our barbell front squat. So what we see here is you've got a variety of different positions: parallel stance, split stance, and single leg. And again, some of these are going to be more sagittal dominant, like the front squat. It's a very sagittal plane exercise, and therefore we can go a little bit heavier. Once you start going on to single leg, we start to add more transversal or frontal plane stress, like we have with the Viper reverse crossover squat. Then you want to reduce the load, but we want to try to get a variation and kind of cover all the subgroups for this particular movement pattern. When we look at the lift exercises, same kind of thing. So we can do like a Romanian deadlift, which is what we see in the top right-hand corner, or the barbell offset grip in the top left-hand corner. Both relatively stable. Obviously, the offset grip is going to be a bit more transverse and a bit more frontal plane, but it's still both a kind of parallel stance. Obviously, they can be made more unstable by doing the exercise in between the two, which is that dumbbell vintage swing. So now we're using a dumbbell rather than a more stable barbell. Or we can start to adopt different stance positions. So we could do that split stance, which is the bottom left-hand corner with a sandbag. So we had a split stance good morning exercise, still a hip dominant lift pattern movement. And then we had even the more dynamic step and reach. So that's where you're actually stepping into a split stance position, and we did that with dumbbells. For some supplementary movements, we had that bodyweight kneeling hip extension, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, which again is going to be working our lift pattern muscles, so calves, hamstrings, glutes, and erector spina. And again, we want to try to cover a nice mixture of different stances, different planes of motion, but all working the hip dominant lower body movement pattern, which is the lift. For the press pattern, well, ideally we want to try to cover 3 different movements, and this is horizontal pressing, vertical pressing upwards, and vertical pressing downwards. Now we kind of see the horizontal pressing with that dumbbell bridge alternating chest press, which is at the top and in the middle. The other 3 exercises are actually all pressing upwards. So we had our kneeling clean and press, which is a bit of a combination movement, but the press part is pressing upwards in the top right with the barbell. We had our shoulder to shoulder press in the top left hand corner with the sandbag, again vertical pressing upwards, adding a little bit more frontal plane stress to that exercise. And then we had our split kneeling overhead press with the dumbbells at the bottom, again adopting a slightly different stance position to get a bit of different core activation. So what we'd want to do in order to complement these movements is combine it with some pressing downwards, and one of the best exercises for that would be something like a bodyweight dip. Now the pull movement pattern follows the same kind of thing as the press movement pattern. So the 3 subgroups would be horizontal pulling, pulling upwards vertically, and pulling downwards. So the cable row, as you see on the left hand side, is more of a horizontal row. The barbell bent over row, which we integrated with a little bit of a pop-up. So what you see in the middle, again, that's another horizontal row. We're just getting into a bent over position to row horizontally. And then we had our kind of pulling upwards, which is what we did with our sandbag high pulls. So the movement pattern that's quite difficult to perform with some of these functional equipment would be a downward pulling movement. And so you'd want to kind of fix that little gap by doing a movement pattern like a lat pull down maybe, or preferably a pull up or something pretty similar where you're actually actively pulling downwards. So here's some rotation exercises. So the three subgroups with this would be again horizontal rotation, rotation upwards, and rotation downwards. So we saw the split kneeling reverse wood chop with the Viper, top left. In the middle then we had our seated med ball slams. We had, which is more of a kind of downward rotation movement. We had our, for upward rotation, our kind of thigh to thigh overhead rotations, top right hand corner. And then in the middle row we had our sandbag lunge and crunch rotation. We had our seated rotations with the battle rope. We had our lunge and rotation with the med ball, and then we had our figure of eights with the sandbag. So we've got a nice variety of different rotation pattern movements there, and the transverse plane is quite undertrained with a lot of people, so it's a good idea to really kind of make sure you're including a good variety of rotation pattern movements in order to improve someone's functional capacity. Now the smash pattern, well, this is a sagittal plane movement focusing on spinal flexion and hip flexion. So we saw the smash pattern done with a slam ball. We need to do this, like we said in the presentation, with a medicine ball that's not going to bounce. And so kind of standing smashes or slams with a medicine ball. You see the top left-hand corner. Top right, we did the lunge and overhead reach. So you're not actually slamming the med ball here, but obviously we're using the same muscles to decelerate that weight as it goes above the head. So you lunge forward and you'll be recruiting those flexors in order to decelerate the med ball as it goes up and behind you. We also did the standing crunch. So when the cable is being pulled down in between the feet, that's very much a pure smash pattern muscle. Once we start to come into each side, then you're going to add a little bit of rotation to it, but you're still going to be working the flexors as you're doing that at the same time. And we also covered a lot of supplementary exercises, and these are great for kind of adding variation, hitting certain muscles, or just kind of working muscles which are part of some of those movement patterns that we've already covered. So we saw kick-ups, which a bit of a supplementary movement for the smash pattern, working the anterior core. We had the split kneeling rainbows with the Viper, which can be working the lateral core. So again, a good little exercise to kind of help us to work in the frontal plane a little bit more. We had our wall prop, which is again good for the anterior core to train it as a stabilizer. We had our, and then in the next row below on the left, our hip bridges with the barbell, again working the hamstrings and glutes, so a bit of a supplementary movement for the lift pattern. We had our 1990 just with kind of body weight. Again, it's a good area that's quite restricted, so kind of training the hip musculature there. We had our lateral step and overhead reach with the cable. Again, really good for working the body in the frontal plane and working the lateral core muscles. And then we also had the tricep extension, so not actually a press pattern movement, but working the triceps forms part of those press pattern muscles, and obviously going to be working our core as our stabilizer. We had the windmill, which is a phenomenally good frontal plane assistant exercise or supplementary exercise. If you don't do it already, really make sure you kind of include windmills within your training program. And then we had a lot of the battle rope exercises, obviously very good from a metabolic perspective, working the upper body and effectively training the upper body with anaerobic conditioning. All of these, like I said, we would group under kind of the general supplementary exercise pattern. So looking at integration, here we have an example session where we're kind of trying to cover as many of these movement patterns as possible. Like I said in the previous presentations, you're never going to be able to cover all of the movement patterns and all of the subgroups of all of those movement patterns within one session. So you want to just try and vary the different movements. So for example, if you do a a rotation horizontally with one session, then maybe try and do a downward rotation or an upward rotation with another session. Here we have an example session. This is a little bit more dynamic, so we may do for the squat movement pattern, the medicine ball squat push press. For the pull, do cable rows. And the medicine ball in particular, the squat push press, is going to be good for getting the heart rate up, so that's what makes it a bit more dynamic. On the lift pattern, we've got Viper swings, and then for the press movement pattern, the sandbag shoulder to shoulder press. Rotation, we're doing those battle rope rotation waves, so again, that's going to be getting the heart rate up as we do the rotation movement. And then for the smash pattern, medicine ball slams. We could add some moving or carrying load, so if you do have a sled in your facility, we could do something like sled push, and then maybe as a supplementary exercise, moving wall prop. So we're trying to cover, again, a variety of different equipment and then a variety of different movement patterns, but trying to keep it a little bit more dynamic in order to get a cardiovascular benefit at the same time. Now, a lot of people obviously consider that if we're doing functional training, then it kind of is somewhat different than if we were doing hypertrophy or strength training. Just because you're following a kind of functional philosophy doesn't mean you can't be doing strength training at the same time. So here we have more of a strength-orientated functional program. In this case, we're kind of looking at a little bit of a more whole body. We're not covering as many different movement patterns because we probably need to be doing more sets in order to get the strength benefit from it. So we would go with more stable exercises, so barbell front squats and barbell overhead press for the squat and press movement patterns, Romanian deadlift for the lift pattern, and then maybe like a single arm dumbbell row. Again, we're going to be able to load that up with a lot more weight than some of the more unstable exercises we've shown you earlier. Moving load, again, we might do something like sled drags, but we'd want to be doing multiple sets with these with higher loads, lower rep ranges and lower time under tension in order to be getting the strength adaptations that we're seeking with this type of session. Again, we would just apply the same philosophy if we were doing more of a hypertrophy type program. So here we see an example hypertrophy session. What you wouldn't do is you wouldn't try and cover everything all in one session, because if we're doing hypertrophy, you're likely to be doing split sessions, but rather than saying, oh, we're going to be doing this body part, you'd look to try and do it with more of a movement pattern. So we would kind of say, okay, let's do our squat movement pattern for this session. So again, might do barbell back squat, nice stable exercise, kind of moderate intensity with a high volume of training. Again, you kind of see the number of exercises has dropped down because we're going to be doing more sets per exercise in order to get the adaptation of hypertrophy. So we might do the squats pattern with a parallel stance with the back squat initially, and then we might also do a split stance with split squats using dumbbells. You could then also kind of apply with some farmer's walks for carrying movement pattern, and then maybe finish off with some additional quad work with a supplementary exercise, maybe even a leg extension machine. So just because we are doing more functional philosophy doesn't mean we can't integrate some of our fixed path machines appropriately as well. So that's it for this presentation. On the review questions, you should now complete the review questions for this module to ensure you met the learning outcomes, and then complete the guided learning practice, and details for this are on the learner management system. You can practice the exercise yourself if you're happy with the techniques, and then practice coaching the exercises to a colleague. Once you complete the review questions and the guided practice for this module, then you can move on to the next one.